Chapter 31 The New Life. The following morning, Jiro left for school without any concern, though his family was to move to the city on that day. The adults thought of making him absent from school because he might feel disappointed to find none of his family when he came home, but he was quite indifferent to such a consideration of the adults. His days at the Masakis went by in peace. As he adapted himself into his new family, he would not quarrel or fight with others so often. He was sometimes taken to his parents' home in the city for the weekend by his grandparents, but was not unwilling to go back with them. The visit to his parental home became a new stimulus to Jiro. The city was an old castle town with a population of about 30,000. His father kept a liquor shop he rented on a busy street. Its front was wide, and in its window were displayed a lot of sake casks wrapped in straw matting, pretty labeled wine bottles, and other goods connected to his trade. They looked so gay and dazzling to the boy. At the back of the shop, however, were some very small and filthy rooms, no match for their old house. The room immediately above the shop was for Kyoichi and Shunzo, where they had their desks, but it did not look like a study room at all. With only one window, small and iron latticed, it looked like a storeroom or something. There was a small yard at the back of the house, just 6 yards square or so, blocked by a mossy earthen storehouse of the next doors, where wet and mold-smelling air was always drifting in, which made Jiro feel sick. He especially hated to go to the toilet, confined and very dim even in the daytime. At the Masakis, he could use a clean and spacious toilet. If he was cold by nature, he could urinate anywhere he liked. In that dismal house, Grandmother Honda looked much more gloomy to Jiro, and everything she said and did to him was irritating simply because the house was so small, dirty, and stifling. When he sat at the table in her company, he felt no appetite at all. On the other hand, Otami, his mother, seemed to become sweeter each time he met her. In the shadowy room, she looked so delicate, which aroused tender feelings toward her in his heart. At times, she walked as far as the outskirts of the city to see him off, or gave him picture books, school things in a pretty case, and so on, she had bought for him. Then Jiro felt as if he were with Ohama, his old nurse. His feeling toward Kyoichi and Shunzo had also been changing for the better compared with when he parted from them. These days he could feel friendly with them because they would play with him. His feelings of hostility towards them had already disappeared. Jiro also enjoyed walking around the city with his brothers, but his greatest delight was his father, though he did not indulge him at all. He sometimes broke his promise to take him to the park for an urgent business. When he left, felt a little disappointed, but did not think that he was cheated. Whenever he visited, Shunsuke would say, "Oh, you're here again," and come upstairs to see him playing with his brothers. Jiro wished he could help his father by quitting his game with them if he was allowed to. In this way, he grew fond of the busy city because of his mother and brothers, who were becoming more and more generous and kind to him. However, he would not have taken the trouble to go all the 10 miles to face grandmother in the obscure room unless he had intended to meet his dearest father. At the Masakis, Jiro could behave quite freely, where cold or stinging words were not hard at all. Of course, he sometimes had his grandparents complain to him or scold him, but it was always he who was to blame, so he could put up with that. His new life at the Masakis was full of various activities. He played seek and hide in a large storehouse where a lot of sumac seeds were piled up in straw bags. When he was in the shed, he felt as if he were exploring a deep cave. Once in a while, Jiro, with his clumsy hands, helped the men and women working on the earthen floor of the main building. He struck the sumac seeds with a wooden hammer, threw the bare twigs into the furnace, and took out the condensed wax oil from the big bowls. Then he sprinkled water with a switch of cedar over the pure white wax powder spread out in the yard. Of all these jobs, he liked lye pouring best. He wanted to do it even if it meant having to be absent from school. On the lye pouring day, some 20 women, free from their daily routine, came from the neighborhood. Some were young and others were old, and they joined the Masakis to make a band of nearly 30 in all. They sat in 2 lines on a straw mat on the earthen floor, with a shallow gray bowl and a wooden pestle placed in front. By and by, several men came in with jars and poured into their bowls a fixed quantity of yellowish-brown liquid made from wax oil. Then you are to stir the liquid. The sandy wax oil turned into a cool, white, sloppy liquid as you stirred it. Calculating the right time, the men poured a scoop of lye into the bowls. Then you had to stir it as quickly as possible with all your might. Very soon it turned white and became so sticky that you could not stir it with ease, when the men swiftly took up the bowls and poured its contents into new bowls. Gradually the wax became solid enough to be planed and dried out. This process lasted several days in a row. Old women would always tell funny stories, and young girls would sing in a charming chorus as they worked. There was no fixed recess except for lunch hour, but each time a bowl was finished, the stirrers could drink a cup of tea and eat boiled sweet potatoes. Sometimes they were served rice cakes too. Jiro often worked as a stirrer. If it happened to be Sunday, he could sit there all day long with a bowl and a pestle. "How patient he is," said a woman. "I don't know a boy like him," said another. "Hi, master, why don't you go and play?" said the third. These words reached his ears only to make him work harder with joy, though he found it very hard at the time of lye pouring. It was too much for a little boy with weak hands. Then he had to ask someone else to do the work, which was not something to be ashamed of. Some women, young and old, needed help from others then. Jiro was fond of playing out of doors as well as indoor activity like lye pouring. He learned how to set fishing lines and put the fish trap in the water. If you set the hook in the evening, you would have eels or catfish on it the next morning. The fishing net, which they called a doke, was a roughly meshed basket-like net made of bamboo. You mixed some mud with roasted rice bran and stuck it on the base of the net. You placed it at the bottom of a shallow pond, which could be seen everywhere in the district. The following morning you could collect carp or minnows. During the fishing season, Jiro sometimes came home late for supper or dashed out, rattling the door very early in the morning, only to be chided by the old folks. Whenever they found time, the local people also went to the big river nearby to net for sea basses and other fish. Jiro was often seen among them. The sea was about 2 miles and a half down the river. If you went in the opposite direction by the river about the same distance, you could come to a cedar grove which had been planted by a famous civil engineer at the end of the 17th century. Jiro liked this place too. Jiro invited his playmates to both places. At the mud-flat beach, they dug for shells, while at the grove they enjoyed climbing the trees and throwing stones at the cedars. He learned how to row a boat and horse riding too, before he was aware of it. On the village festival days, he took part in it with his cousins and sometimes helped young adults to prepare for the festival. What he experienced at the Masakis would have been impossible if he was living with his own family in the city. As he had a lot of pleasant experiences with the Masakis, he came to know what it was to live a farmer's life. He sometimes helped them too. At the village school, he could meet Ryuichi, his best friend, every day, but took the trouble of mailing a card to explain about his life at the Masakis. His real intention was that Haruko, Ryuichi's pretty sister, would find and read it. One day, a fairy story book was delivered to Jiro at the Masakis by mistake. It turned out to belong to Machiko, Kyoichi's girlfriend. Jiro did not hand it to her, but sent it back to her by mail. He secretly expected Machiko to give him a letter of thanks. For the next several days, he was looking forward to the postman's rounds in vain. It was not that he was in love with them, but that he only wanted to receive a letter from someone. He had a strong desire to receiving mail. The New Year's card from Otsuru had been kept with him quite a long time. Whenever he had a letter from his family, he would read it aloud to his cousins. Perhaps a kind of romantic sentiment was involved in his waiting for answers from Haruko or Machiko. Once in a while, he went to the river, where he gazed at the water, looked at the sky, and listened to the wind or birds. One day he went to the river and sat on the grassy bank to watch a red crab climbing up and down a reed. To his surprise, it lasted as long as 1 hour or so. Whenever he went there, he would think of the keeper's room, Ohama, old Yasaku, Otsuru, Okane, and Kansaku. He was also absorbed in remembering what had happened to him before he was taken to the Masakis. Once in a while, he enjoyed taking the lives of little creatures like insects, a bad habit of his since he was an infant. Each time, though, he felt guilty after such brutal behavior. It never failed to make him remember seeing a sign of vengeance on an oak tree on the outskirts of his village. There was a small shrine there, and at the back in the grove stood a tall oak tree. 5 nails were hammered into its trunk. He was told that someone had done it with an evil wish of disfiguring someone else's eyes, ears, and mouth. The hammered-in nails looked like a shape of a man's face. He shuddered at the thought of the insect's vengeance. It was also true that a sort of faint idea was being formed in his mind that an unexpected enemy or incident might come up at any moment and any place. He was too young to meditate about fate. At school, he got the best marks in composition. The teacher sometimes read his essays aloud in the class, though most of them were about passive and sentimental topics rather than positive or delightful ones. Anyway, his new life at the Masakis was going well and getting enriched by his various experiences.